Hey everybody, this is a piece titled on Identity Politics, Ressentiment, and the Evacuation of Human Emancipation by Camila Bassi. It might be Camila, can't remember. Anyway, quote, "The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living." Karl Marx. Quote, "The late modern liberal subject quite literally sees with ressentiment." Wendy Brown. Introduction. At the UK-based National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts, I can't copy and paste things, so I'm not going to be looking things up, so you'll just have to bear with me here. At the UK-based National Campaign Against Fees and Cuts, NCAFC, annual conference, held at the University of Birmingham Students' Union on November 23, 2013, I spoke on a panel titled Privilege, Intersectionality, and Fighting Oppression. In preparation for my talk, I'd assumed no prior knowledge on the audience's behalf so as to make my intervention as accessible as possible. My basic introduction of Marxism therein was to illustrate both its intersectionality and its distinct perspective on exploitation and resistance. One of the other panel speakers stated during the discussion that I had, quote, made an assumption that everyone in the room was at the same level, end quote. On that, quote, the use of high convoluted language by people who are able to read theory, end quote, is a, quote, privilege, and is therefore, quote, oppressive and, quote, exclusionary. She frustrated that in such discussions about privilege and intersectionality, about privilege and intersectionality, question mark, and parenthesis, people, parenthesis, in general, question mark, and parenthesis, quote, refused to shut up about Marx, end quote. She pushed an anti-intellectualism and an anti-Marxism which troubled me since there was no reflection on such questions, simply indictments. Moreover, she appeared to be angry with me and that puzzled me because I had kept my contribution respectful of other positions. I wondered then how emotionally healthy and politically useful is an anger that forestalls open thought and exchange. On the 1st of May 2014, International Workers' Day, I attended a session titled Intersectionality, Checking Our Own Privilege at the launch event of the Free University of Sheffield. The African American woman leading the session problematized an image used by the white organizers, to advertise the event, an image she described as black African children holding a free education poster. This was, she said, quote, an ignorant appropriation, end quote. The white audience sat in an awkward moment of silence, looking concerned by their accidental but privileged appropriation of an image of the unprivileged. I, a British Indian, was one of the two non-white participants in the room. The other, of course, was the session leader. I spoke up, quote, while we must be sensitive to the temporal and spatial specificities and therein the lived experiences of such images, there's also something universal here, end quote. The session leader replied with incredulity, quote, what could you possibly think you had in common with the people in the image, end quote. I suggested, quote, the universal struggle for free education, and also perhaps the universal struggle for free health care, and the universal struggle for independent trade unions, end quote. There was no reply, just another moment of awkward silence. At the end of the session, I left with the impression of a politics where no one can speak for anyone else, resulting in navel-gazing entanglement. The academic repression I proceed to discuss in this chapter is that by a neoliberal wave of identity politics in the form of intersectionality and privilege theory. It is a repression of self by self which precludes connection, bypasses freedom, and generates ressentiment. I explore a specific case of the political deadlock between a current of radical feminists and a current of transgender and transsexual activists, both with wider sympathies, which is played out on social media and across university campuses. I also offer a general theoretical and practical call for dialogue between left-wing academics and students in the hope that we can, once again, collectively aspire for freedom. Where did freedom go? New section. In States of Inquiry, the book, political scientist Wendy Brown, in 1995, observed that in the era of late modernity, as the bleak reality of a contorted Marxism is framed against the sunshine of liberalism, progressives have chosen to pursue a form of freedom which is based on state-managed economic justice and private liberties. Furthermore, freedom, end quote, has shown freedom self to be easily appropriated in liberal regimes for the most cynical and unemancipatory political ends, end quote, such that, quote, the dream of democracy, that humans might govern themselves by governing together, is difficult to discern in the proliferation, end bracket, claims of rights, protections, regulations, and entitlements, end quote. Wendy Brown. Wendy Brown does not dispute the importance of rights, protections, regulations, and entitlements, but rather Brown asks, beyond this, what is our dream of freedom? Brown defends the explanatory power of Marxism in seeing the question of freedom vis-a-vis social relations, which are, quote, implicitly declared, quote, unpolitical, end quote, that is, naturalized in liberal discourse, end quote. Brown. In other words, genuine freedom cannot be found in state, distribution. Here it is helpful to understand the important distinction Marx makes between, quote, political emancipation, end quote, and, quote, human emancipation, end quote, which can be found in his essay on, quote, the Jewish question, end quote, from 1843. That was part of a debate with the left Hegelian Bruno Bauer. Marx's discussion is not, per se, a consideration of the Jewish condition, but a critique of political emancipation in order to expose the relationship of political emancipation to human emancipation. Marx acknowledged that, quote, the great, real practical, Marx acknowledged the, quote, great, real practical, end quote, progress of political emancipation, that is, liberal rights and liberties. However, on its limits, Marx argues that whilst the capitalist state abolishes, in the capitalist state's own way, the distinction of class, birth, profession, and education, by declaring them, quote, to be unpolitical differences, end quote, it allows them, quote, to have an effect in their own manner, end quote. What is inherent in political emancipation, Marx spells out, is a gap between human beings as, ideally, public members of a universal state, or, quote, citizens, end quote, and materially private, egoistic members of society, or, quote, bourgeois, end quote. As such, humankind leads a twofold existence, quote, a heavenly existence and an earthly existence, end quote. Private rights are innately, quote, bourgeois, end quote, and the basis of the separation of human beings from one another. Quote, man was, end bracket, not free from religion. Man received freedom of rights. Man received freedom of religion. Man was not freed from property. Man received freedom of property. Man was not freed from the egoism of trade. Man received freedom to trade, end quote. Marx. On the Jewish question. Marx deplored the debasement of theory, art, history, nature, and human relations by religion, property, commodities, and commerce. Marx deplores the battering of women, quote, the species relationship itself, end quote, as, quote, an object of commerce, end quote. The bartering of women, quote, the species relationship itself, end quote, as, quote, an object of commerce, end quote. This debasement, Marx contends, is the exile of human beings' communal essence. Marx foresaw human liberation as the eradication of the aforementioned gap. In other words, the freedom of human beings is contingent not merely on political emancipation, but on human emancipation, which necessitates the abolition of capitalist social relations. Returning to Brown's States of Inquiry, She astutely remarks that the right's ability to capture a discourse of freedom for its own ends, alongside the tendency of progressive politics to abandon the socialist project on the basis of its supposed failure, apropos Stalinism, has led in academia to, quote, developments in philosophy and in feminist post-colonial and cultural theory, that, have eroded freedom's ground. For many toiling in those domains, quote, freedom, end quote, has been swept onto the dust heap of anachronistic, humanistic, androcentric, subject-centered, and, quote, Western shibboleths, end quote, end quote. Wendy Brown. So while Marxism desires human emancipation from capitalism, Brown asks, quote, to what extent do identity politics require a standard internal to existing society against which it pitches their claims? A standard that not only preserves capitalism from critique, but sustains the invisibility and inarticulation of class, not accidentally but endemically. Could we have stumbled upon one reason why class is invariably named, but rather theorized or developed in the multiculturalist mantra, quote, race, class, gender, sexuality, end quote. End quote. Wendy Brown. Bringing forward Brown's argument, it is worth considering the context for the present-day popularity of privilege theory and intersectionality. New section, Identity Politics and Self-Subjugation. Privilege theorist pioneer McIntosh stated, quote, what I believe is that everybody has a combination of unearned advantage and unearned disadvantage in life, ... We're all put ahead and behind by the circumstances of our birth, ... In order to understand the way privilege works, you have to be able to see patterns and systems in social life, but you also have to care about individual experiences. I think one's own individual experience is sacred. Testifying to it is very important, end quote. The basic premise of privilege theory is that wherever there is an oppressive structure, capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, heteronormativity, and so on, there is both an oppressed group of people and a privileged group of people, who consciously or not benefit from that structure, end parenthesis. Interlaced with privilege theory is the notion of intersectionality, that we are all privileged by some structures of oppression and burdened by other some structures of oppression and burdened by other structures of oppression. Thus our privileges and our oppressions intersect. At a macro level, race, gender, and class, for example, are seen as, quote, distinct yet interlocking structures of oppression, end quote. Collins, 1993. Whereas, quote, the notion of intersectionality describes micro-level processes, namely, how each individual and group occupies a social position within interlocking structures of oppression, end quote. Collins, 1997. Moreover, in a matrix of domination, quote, each individual derives varying amounts of penalty and privilege from the multiple systems of oppression which frame everyone's lives, end quote. Collins, 1990. By lacking full awareness of our privileges and our privileges' intersectionality, the reasoning goes we are politically divided and weak, and whilst we cannot be held responsible for the structures of oppression that impart privilege upon us, we do have a choice in how we respond to our privilege, for instance to our whiteness, our maleness, our straightness, our ableness, our cisness, etc., etc. Only one etc. Just all the way spelled out. So I thought it was said twice. I thought it was etc, but that's just, it just says etc. spelled out. The origin of privilege theory and intersectionality can be traced to the theoretical framework of identity politics in the 1980s and 1990s, which developed amid labor movement defeats and the expansion of the neoliberal project of free market capitalism, including free trade, deregulation, privatization, and austerity, during the Thatcher and Reagan years. In Britain specifically, the government policy of multiculturalism in the 1980s and 1990s, popular with leftist local councils, furthered the notion of discrete, quote, ethnic, end quote, identities from which gains could be made by state accommodation. And from 1998, marketization began in the higher education sector with the introduction of tuition fees, the Druring Report, 1997, end parenthesis. By the late 1980s and 1990s, second-wave feminism had given way to third-wave feminism, whose theory was very much influenced by academic postmodernism and identity politics. Third-wave feminists Kimberly Crenshaw, 1991, and Patricia Hill Collins, 1990, developed the concept of intersectionality in the early 1990s. Both also drew on earlier second-wave feminist discussions by black feminists in the United States. In 1977, the Boston-based black lesbian feminist Combahee River Collective, parenthesis, 1977, end parenthesis, advanced the concept of, quote, simultaneity, end quote, and stressed the importance of personal identity. Quote, we believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression, end quote. The elephant in the room vis-a-vis the identity politics of intersectionality and privilege theory is Marxism. Collins in 2000 dismissed the, quote, radical bracket Marxist end bracket left, end quote, as saying, quote, if only people of color and women could see their true class interests, ... class solidarity would eliminate racism and sexism, end quote. There can be no denying an element of truth to this claim. What's more, dominant sections of the revolutionary Marxist left have a damning record of pandering to racism, sexism, and homophobia for organizational gain. See Bassi, 2013a, 2013b, 2013c. But abandoning altogether the explanatory power of Marxism leaves us short on the question of how to achieve social change. Intersectionality applies a generalized cultural and economic understanding of class alongside other registers of oppression such as gender and sexuality. Parenthesis, see Heafy 2011 and Taylor 2011, end parenthesis. I question what might be lost in its implicit redefinition of class, qua classism, when thinking through the nature of oppression and exploitation and the meaning of resistance. Class, after all, is not primarily a structure of oppression, but a systematic relation of exploitation. Parenthesis, Bassi, 2010, end parenthesis. Given also that racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, for instance, are individually distinct forms of oppression with individually distinct relationships to capitalism, which include specific and universal features, the danger with intersectionality lies in intersectionality sliding into a conceptual collapse through intersectionality's kaleidoscopic intersecting structures of oppression and in it nullifying universality while in pursuit of specificity. Parenthesis, Bassi, 2016, end parenthesis. In privilege theory, people tend to talk about, quote, white supremacy, end quote, rather than, quote, racism, end quote. But the former carries no explanatory power over racism. The former, white supremacy, carries no explanatory power over the latter, racism. While white supremacy falls short in being able to analyze and politically respond to anti-Irish racism, anti-Gypsy racism, anti-Semitism, for example, and the emphasis on personal testimony. Parenthesis, remember, as McIntosh states, quote, one's individual experience is sacred, end quote, overrides the possibility of any universal truths. The net effect is, quote, no way out, end quote, vis-a-vis resistance. Marx, parenthesis, 1843, end parenthesis, made plain in On the, quote, Jewish Question, end quote, that the route to real freedom lies in social relations, not rights alone. Brown's astute point on the lack of theorizing of class in the multiculturalist mantra resonates especially well in the present-day privilege theory and intersectionality mantra. Is it not time to name and call out once more what is, in reality, the relinquishment of the dream of freedom as humans governing themselves by governing together? Present-day identity politics is based on unchanging status. As privilege theorist Kimmel, parenthesis, 2013, end parenthesis, asserts, quote, one can no more renounce privilege than one can stop breathing, end quote, rather than a dynamic understanding of human consciousness through human history. Society is viewed as a seesaw, You are up there because I am down here, and you are up there because you weigh me down, is a personalized dual-camp distortion of social relations, quote, me versus you, end quote, with various intersectional combinations, end parenthesis, that breeds resentment and is devoid of class politics. Ultimately, freedom has become dangerously lost in the contradiction of identity politics. As Brown, parenthesis, 1995, end parenthesis, observed, quote, politicized identities generated out of liberal disciplinary societies, insofar as these politicized identities are premised on exclusion from a universal ideal, require that universal ideal, as well as those politicized identities' exclusion from that universal ideal, for those politicized identities' own continuing existence as identities, end quote. Brown develops Nietzsche's concept of ressentiment to explain how the desired impulse of politicized identity, quote, to inscribe in the law and other political registers its historical and present pain, end quote, forecloses, quote, an imagined future of power to make itself, end quote. What one has instead of freedom, then, is the production of ressentiment. Quote, ressentiment is, in this context, is a triple achievement. It produces an effect, parenthesis, rage, righteousness, end parenthesis, that overwhelms the hurt. It produces a culprit responsible for the hurt, and it produces a site of revenge to displace the hurt, parenthesis, a place to inflict hurt as the sufferer has been hurt, end parenthesis, end quote. Wendy Brown. We are left with an effort to anesthetize and to externalize what is unendurable. I turn now to this chapter's case study, a toxic war between a current of radical feminists and a current of trans activists, both of which with wide layers of sympathizers. This is a war that is played out on social media and across university campuses, and which has impeded connection, circumvented freedom, and bred ressentiment. New section. Privileged production of impasse. The case of the deadlock between radical feminists and trans activists. In February 2015, a letter titled, quote, "We cannot allow censorship and silencing of individuals," end quote, was published in The Observer, signed by several academics and feminist and LGBT activists. It identifies, quote, "a worrying pattern of intimidation and silencing of individuals whose views are deemed, quote, transphobic," end quote, or, quote, whorephobic, end quote. Most of the people so labeled are feminist or pro-feminist men, feminists or pro-feminist men. Some have experience in the sex industry, some are transgender, ... Quote, "no platforming," end quote, used to be a tactic used against self-proclaimed fascist and Holocaust deniers. But today, no platforming is being used to prevent the expression of feminist arguments critical of the sex industry and of some demands made by trans activists. The feminists who hold these views have never advocated or engaged in violence against any group of people. Yet it is argued that the mere presence of anyone said to hold these views is a threat to a protected minority group's safety. You do not have to agree with the views that are being silenced to find these tactics illiberal and undemocratic. Universities have a particular responsibility to resist this kind of bullying," end quote. As important background to this letter, two high-profile public confrontations are worth noting. The first relates to the radical feminist Julie Bindel. In 2012, the National Union of Students, NUS, LGBTQ campaign passed a motion of no platform against Julie Bindel for Julie Bindel's alleged transphobia. Julie Bindel had made offensive comments in relation to transsexual people in a 2004 piece for The Guardian, which she later apologized for as, quote, misplaced and insensitive, end quote, parenthesis, Bindel, 2007, end parenthesis. The NUS motion included the sentence, quote, "Conference believes that Julie Bindel is vile," end quote, parenthesis, Deacon, 2014, end parenthesis. The history of the National Union of Students' no-platform policy relates specifically to fascism, and debate on no platform has tended to center on the question, while fascists, parenthesis, given the direct physical threat fascists pose, end parenthesis, must be no platform, should one, and indeed can one, no platform racists? In this context, the no platforming of Julie Bindel is extraordinary, as she joined a list that includes al-Muhajiroun, the British National Party, the English Defence League, and Hizb ut-Tahrir, fascistic political forces that incite violence. In autumn 2014, Bindel was due to speak at the University of Sheffield Students' Union on her book, Straight Expectations. But a week before she was due, the student management banned her, parenthesis, Deacon 2014, end parenthesis. A year later, in autumn 2015, Bindel was invited by the Free Speech and Secular Society at the University of Manchester Students' Union to partake in a debate titled, quote, From Liberation to Censorship, Does Modern Feminism Have a Problem with Free Speech? Once again, Julie Bindel was banned by the student management. The Students' Union women's officer stated in defense of the decision that this, quote, is not about shutting down conversations or denying free speech. This is about keeping our students safe, end quote. Parenthesis, Palmer, 2015, end parenthesis. The second high-profile public confrontation was the backlash generated from an article titled Seeing Red in the New Statesman in 2013, written by the journalist and feminist Suzanne Moore. In the article, Moore, parenthesis, 2013, end parenthesis, argued against austerity and for those who are hardest hit by austerity, women, to be angry and to resist. Quote, It's not just the double shift of work and domestic duties that women do. There's now a third shift. We must keep ourselves sexually attractive forever. ... The cliche is that female anger is always turned inwards rather than outwards into despair. We are angry with ourselves for not being happier, not being loved properly, and not having the ideal body shape. That of a Brazilian transsexual. We are angry that men do not do enough. We are angry at work where we are underpaid and overlooked. This anger can be neatly channeled and outsourced to make someone a fat profit. Are your hormones okay? Do you need a nice bath? End quote. A significant reaction followed this publication against Moore's alleged transphobic reference to, quote, a Brazilian transsexual, end quote. Parenthesis, an implicit reference to the model Leah T, end parenthesis. This was a vitriolic row between the main radical feminists and trans activists, which was played out on social media and in the press, and included Moore herself temporarily resigning from Twitter, apologizing for a, quote, throwaway comment, and stating, quote, I am not your enemy, end quote. Parenthesis, Wynick, 2013, end parenthesis. Cultural theory academic Sarah Ahmed, parenthesis, 2015, end parenthesis, in retort to the Observer, parenthesis, 2015, end parenthesis, letter, quote, we cannot allow censorship and silencing of individuals, end quote, contending in a blog post titled, quote, you are oppressing us, end quote. Politics is rarely about, quote, politics is really about one good and one bad side, nor about innocence on one side and guilt on the other. But politics is also messy because power is asymmetrical. ... Transphobia and anti-trans statements should not be treated as just another viewpoint that we should be free to express at a happy diversity table. There cannot be a dialogue when some at the table are in effect or intent arguing for the elimination of other people at the table. ... The presentation of trans activists as a lobby and as bullies rather than as minorities who are constantly being called upon to defend their right to exist is a mechanism of power. Sadly, this letter is evidence that the mechanism is working. ... Racists present themselves as injured / under attack / a minority fighting against a powerful anti-racist lobby that is, quote, busy, end quote, suppressing their voices, we can hear resonance without assuming analogy, end quote. Contrary to Ahmed, parenthesis, 2015, end parenthesis, here, Brown, parenthesis, 1995, end parenthesis, stressed that while we must recognize that, quote, social injury such as that conveyed through derogatory speech becomes that which is, quote, unacceptable, end quote, and, quote, individually culpable, end quote, it actually, quote, symptomizes deep political distress in the culture. Symptomizes deep political distress in the culture, end quote. Parenthesis, my emphasis, end parenthesis. One day after the Observer letter was published, signatory and English classics academic Mary Beard, parenthesis, Lusher, 2015, end parenthesis, reported, quote, last night I went to bed wanting to weep, ... It was the relentless pummeling of attack on the basis of extraordinary loaded, sometimes quite wrong readings of the letter. Excuse me 1 second. Quote, last night when I went to bed wanting to weep, ... It was the relentless pummeling of attack on the basis of extraordinary, loaded, sometimes quite wrong reading of the letter. The complaints fall into several categories. 1. I am an appalling transphobe. 2. I'm a bit past it, a poor old lady who hasn't quite got the issue straight, bless her. 3. I have been duped by the transphobes because I am a nice person, really. I was not signing up to an attack on the trans community, end quote. Another signatory, human rights activist Peter Tatchell, parenthesis, Lusher, 2015, end parenthesis, stated, quote, I've received about 5,000 messages attacking me. The volume and vitriol of the attack has been almost unprecedented in 48 years of human rights campaigning. I'm shocked. I've supported the transgender freedom struggle for 40 years, but I've been accused of trying to silence trans people and called, quote, an advocate for oppressors, end quote. The letter was about freedom of speech and includes no attack on trans rights. When I signed the letter, I didn't know who else was going to sign it. Now I'm being condemned by the McCarthyite tactic of guilty by association, end quote. Here we see in action the aforementioned triple feat of ressentiment, the production of an affect, parenthesis, a rage into righteousness, end parenthesis, that overwhelms a hurt, a culprit who is responsible for the hurt, and a sight of revenge to displace the hurt, all of which temporarily anesthetize and externalize the hurt, but demolish any potential for political coalition. The radical feminist and trans activist deadlock is the privileged production of impasse, and a symptom of acute political distress in which freedom has been abandoned for ressentiment. On the one hand, we have a camp of people insisting that those born into biologically male bodies carry privilege regardless of their identification as women. Privilege over women who have an entire lived experience of being women and its related oppression. On the other, we have a camp of people arguing that there are those who are cisgendered, parenthesis, whose gender aligns with their sex at birth, end parenthesis, and who carry cis power and privilege over those who have a lived experience of being transgendered, parenthesis, whose gender doesn't align with their sex at birth, end parenthesis, and of its related oppression. In a neoliberal wave of identity politics, the politicized identification of personal bodily experiences and the struggle to trump or negate such bodily experiences in a battle over power asymmetry effectively lets power off the hook. Privilege theory activist Mackenzie, parenthesis, 2014, end parenthesis, prescribed 4 ways to push back against one's privilege. 1. Relinquish power. 2. Don't go. Parenthesis, she uses an example of woman-only events that exclude trans women. End parenthesis. 3. Shut up. And 4. Be careful what identities you claim. Parenthesis, quote, consider, end quote, she says, quote, how your privilege, gives you access to claim identities even when your lived experience does not support it, end quote. The irony that Mackenzie advocated a, quote, no turning up, end quote, protest against the radical feminist exclusion of trans women from women-only spaces is that radical feminists are employing their own argument against claiming identities when lived experience does not correspond. Crucially, Mackenzie's prescription encapsulates how a politics that promises to allow a plethora of voices to be heard is in actuality the opposite. A ressentiment seething silencing. I speak, you shut up. You cannot know my pain. Your experience is incomparable to my suffering. The impasse between radical feminists and trans activists is just this, a silencing, either of trans activists or of radical feminists, or a wider layer of sympathizers on either side, on both sides, or on neither side. Instructively, in an effort to bring peace to the so-called, quote, border wars, end quote, between butch lesbians and female-to-male transsexuals, gender and queer theorist ʁ, parenthesis, 1998, end parenthesis, noted that, quote, many subjects, not only transsexual subjects, do not feel at home in their bodies, end quote, and insist on taking into account the wider neoliberal political economic context, quote, because body flexibility has become both a commodity, parenthesis, in the case of cosmetic surgeries, for example, end parenthesis, and a form of commodification, it is not enough in this, quote, age of flexibility, end quote, to celebrate gender flexibility as simply another sign of progress and liberation, end quote. Halberstrom, parenthesis, 2005, end parenthesis, remarked, quote, in mainstream gay, lesbian, and trans communities in the United States, battles rage about what group occupies the more transgressive or aggrieved position, and only rarely are such debates framed in terms of larger discussions about capitalism, class, or economics, end quote. Halberstrom, 2005. Quote, transgressive exceptionalism, end quote. Quote, a byproduct of local translation of neoliberalism, end quote, has become, quote, the practice of taking the moral high ground by claiming to be more oppressed and more extraordinary than others, end quote. Parenthesis, Halberstrom, 2005, end parenthesis. Halberstrom's parenthesis, 2005, end parenthesis, notion of transgressive exceptionalism chimes with the work of Brown, parenthesis, 1994, end parenthesis, on wound culture as a contemporary form of Nietzschean ressentiment, in which, as Cadman, parenthesis, 2006, end parenthesis, put it, quote, current forms of, quote, identity politics, end quote, become, quote, attached, end quote, to destructive modes of their own subjugation, end quote. Cadman. The political challenge we are left with is, how do we support the struggle for political emancipation by and for trans activist movements worldwide, while demanding open space to critically understand and debate the construction of gender, and to forge alliances for future human emancipation? New section. Finding our way back to freedom. The chasm Marx identified between human beings as, on the one hand, citizens of a universal community, and on the other hand, private, alienated, egoistic individuals of a civil society, is reflected in the contradiction of a neoliberal wave of identity politics considered and critiqued in this chapter. Halberstrom, 2005, end bracket, is correct in seeing the identity politics problematic as, in part, a failure of the academy itself. Quote, the rehearsal of identity-bound debates outside the academy speaks not simply to a lack of sophistication in such debates, but suggests that academics have failed to take their ideas beyond the university and have not made necessary interventions into public intellectual venues. End quote. Halberstrom. Brown, parenthesis, 1995, end parenthesis, going further still, recognized academic developments in philosophy and in feminist post-colonial and cultural theory as foreclosing any kind of socialist project for human emancipation on the basis of the failure of Stalinism, which is cruelly subsumed into Marxism in general. Our journey back to the dream of freedom requires us as academics making a case for supplanting a politics of, quote, I am, end quote, which closes down identity and fixes it within a social and moral hierarchy, with a politics of, quote, I want this for us, end quote. I want to repeat that whole sentence because that last bit was in italics, but I think the whole sentence is good. Our journey back to the dream of freedom requires us as academics making a case for supplanting a politics of, quote, I am, end quote, which closes down identity and fixes it within a social and moral hierarchy, with the politics of, quote, I want this for us, end quote. If we fail to help make this happen, we will remain locked in a history that is, quote, weight but no trajectory, mass but no coherence, force but no direction, end quote, thus stagnating in a, quote, war without ends or end, end quote. I end with 10 tactics for challenging the academic repression of identity politics. 1. To positively engage in aspects of intersectionality and privilege theory that strengthen and enrich more traditional forms of class politics, for example, by taking into account and reflecting upon the specific experiences and intersectionalities of oppressions. 2. To challenge the aspects of intersectionality and privilege theory that effectively fix human identity and detach human identity from evolving material conditions of existence. 3. To expose and explore the elephant in the room of intersectionality and privilege theory, i.e. Marxism, in order to critically assess its insight into the relationship between political emancipation and human emancipation. 4. To call upon academics to engage at the politics on their university campuses and in student activist circles. 5. To organize teach-ins and reading groups between academics and their students on political theory and issues. 6. To forge alliances between labor movement struggles and individuals and groups striving for social justice via identity politics. 7. To learn the history of past alliances between labor movement struggles and individuals and groups striving for social justice through identity politics in order to understand the potential for an intersectional class politics. For example, by examining the case of the 1984 to 1985 lesbians and gays support the minors group, as documented by the film Pride. 8. To identify and develop collective campaigns on pressing political issues, such as for the full and decent provision of social housing, including the safeguarding of those most vulnerable to abuse by landlords in the private rental sector, transgender and transsexual people. 9. To foster dialogue and debate on the nature of oppressions and exploitation and the means to resistance and social change. 10. To forge a politics that is attuned to both specificities and their connections to universal struggles for democracy, freedom, and social change. Okay, so that's the end of the piece. I'm going to read the references now. You can click out if you want to. S. Ahmed, you are oppressing us! ! From feministkilljoys.com. Camila Bassi, 2016. What's radical about reality TV? An unexpected tale from Shanghai of a Chinese lesbian anti-hero. Camila Bassi, 2010. Quote, it's new but not that new, end quote, on the continued use of old marks, published in Feminist Legal Studies. Camila Bassi, 2013, Towards an Honest History, the Case of the Militant Tendency. That's from the Anemic on a Bike WordPress. That's also the name, I believe, of Camila Bassi's channel. Camila Bassi, 2013, Further Excavation of the Militant Tendency. Towards Further Excavation of the Militant Tendency from Anemic on a Bike blog. Camila Bassi, Sexist and Misogynistic Ridicule is Not Decent Class Analysis. It's from her blog as well. J. Bindel, My Transmission, published in The Guardian, 2007. Wendy Brown, 1995. States of Injury, Power and Freedom in Late Modernity. L. Cadman, 2006, A Genealogy of Biopolitical Contestation During the Reform of the Mental Health Act. Combahee River Collective Statement from 1977. Kimberly Crenshaw, 1991, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identipolitics, and Violence Against Women of Color. L. Deacon, 2014, Sheffield SU and NUS Ban on Julie Bindel. An affront to free speech, our intellectual freedom, and an insult to students. That's from Huffington Post, 2014. J. Halberstam, 1998, Female Masculinity. J. Halberstam, 2005, In a Queer Time and Place, Transgender Bodies, Subcultural Lives. B. Heafy, 2011, Gay Identities and the Culture of Class. P. Hill Collins, 1990, Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment. P. Hill Collins, 1993, Toward a New Vision, Race, Class, and Gender as Categories of Analysis and Connection. P. Hill Collins, 1997, on West and Fenster Makers, quote, Doing Difference, end quote, in M.R. Walsh's edited volume, Women, Men, and Gender, Ongoing Debates. M.S. Kimmel and A.L. Ferber, 2013, Privilege a Reader. 2015 letter, We Cannot Allow Censorship and Silencing of Individuals, published in The Observer, retrieved from TheGuardian.com. A. Lusher, 2013, Transgender activists target Peter Tatchell and Mary Beard for free speech letter, published in The Independent. Marx, on the Jewish question, in David McClellan's Karl Marx Selected Writings. Marx, 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, in McClellan's Karl Marx Selected Writings. M. Mackenzie, 2014, 4 Ways to Push Back Against Your Privilege, from blackgirldangerous.org. Suzanne Moore, 2013, Seeing Red, published in New Statesman. E. Palmer, in 2015, quote, Transphobic, end quote, feminist, Julie Bindel, banned from Manchester Student Union talk on free speech. It's published in the International Business Times. J. Rothman, 2014, The Origins of, quote, Privilege, end quote, an interview with Peggy McIntosh. It could be pronounced Macintosh, but it's with an MC, so I don't know. Y. Taylor, 2011, Sexualities in Class. The Deering Report, parenthesis, from 1997, retrieved from educationengland.org. And finally, A. Wynick, 2013, quote, Threatening, Ignorant, and Nasty, end quote. Suzanne Moore leaves Twitter over transgender row, published in The Mirror, and retrieved from The Mirror. Thanks for listening.